Hey guys, I hate we couldn't meet this week, but I still want to go over this lecture, so that way we have time to go over new material next week. As far as the Lowell Mills assignment, I'll go over that in a separate video, which I'll post. But really, you can see here that this lecture is pretty broad. We're going to talk about specifics next week, when we're face to face or on a Zoom meeting on Wednesday. But nonetheless, I want to give you some of the basics of the first industrial revolution, some of the major inventions that really changed the United States and its economy. And so you can see here starting out, just with the date range from 1794 to 1869, that is a very broad, range there. I mean, a lot of changes take place during that time. And as historians often do, we kind of categorize, these big swaths of time in certain periods, even though, living in 1794 versus living in 1869 were drastically different. But all of these changes really take place during this time period, and there will be a second industrial revolution, which you'll learn more about, probably next semester. But nonetheless, these are the major things I'm going to go over in this lecture. I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time on the first one there with the Embargo Act, but I am going to talk a lot about Eli Whitney and his invention of the cotton gin that really transforms the Southern economy. Then we have cotton and cloth, interchangeable parts that really, shape the way that we are able to, have mass production. Interchangeable parts is huge. No longer do you have to have, a blacksmith on site to make specific parts for specific machines. You have a patent in which you patent your design for a machine, and then, you make parts for those machines in order to be fixed over time. And so with everybody using the same machines, you can now change out those parts, and it was a lot more cost effective and made the cost of producing manufactured goods a lot cheaper. The expansions in transportation. So in the beginning, we're going to look at things like canals and the Erie Canal that really, opens up trade for cities on the Great Lakes, such as, Cincinnati, Cleveland, maybe not Cleveland. I don't know. I'm not looking at the map. Not super good at Ohio geography, but nonetheless, places like Detroit and Chicago, those major cities in the Midwest are opened up to trade through the Great Lakes with the Erie Canal. Accelerated the manufacturing process, or sorry, let me go over steam power. So steam power is vitally important because if you remember me talking a little bit about the first textile mills, they were developed in New England. And the reason they were developed there specifically was for a variety of reasons, but one key reason was the fast-flowing rivers you have in and around New England, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, those areas. And you needed those fast-flowing, kind of rocky rivers to turn those water wheels quickly to power the mill. But once, they developed the steam engine, you can now have a power plant, you can now have a factory really anywhere as long as you have a steady fuel supply. And that could be coal or that could be oil. But nonetheless, as long as you can have a fuel source, you can pretty much build a factory anywhere. And this is why we'll see manufacturing, particularly for textiles, spread further south. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about here is kind of the good and bad. So, we really benefit from the Industrial Revolution today. Things like our iPhones, our MacBooks, our cars, all of these, get their roots from the industrialization of the United States and the Industrial Revolution. Even the way, we get up by, an alarm clock in the morning, all of those little things are shaped or really shape our lives come from this time period and this revolution that takes place really in the way, humans live and Americans live. But for those who really went through these early stages or lived through these early stages of the Industrial Revolution, they may have saw things a little bit differently. They kind of, bore the brunt of, kind of sacrificing, happiness for progress. And we'll look at that in things like child labor as we move forward. The Embargo Act, really all I want to mention here is that with the War of 1812, once that is over, what you have is that surge in nationalism, but you also have, the United States now doesn't have to worry about interference with shipping on the Atlantic. and interference with shipping between the United States and Europe. So this really helps our economy become more globalized. We don't have to worry about ships being seized or dealing with the bureaucracy of the British or the French. And so now we're really open to trade with the world. And there's this era in the United States, with that nationalism and through the era of good feelings, the economy starts to do well. More investment within the U.S. economy. Not as focused on war or anything like that. The effort of the nation could be focused on industrialization, building projects like the Erie Canal and the National Road, and the federal government starts taking a stance of supplying infrastructure to see our economy grow. I'm going to skip that. And so we have the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. And it's vitally important. So Eli Whitney invents this in 1794. That date looks familiar. Remember, that's kind of when this first industrial revolution starts. It's a fairly simple invention. Really, it's just like a series of combs that you run cotton through. You have a little crank that you work, and through that, it removes the seeds out of the cotton. While that seems fairly simple, and it is rather simple, this changed cotton production for the United States because this was a very labor-intensive process. Before the invention of the cotton gin, this all had to be done by hand. Somebody had to sit there with their hands very tediously, pick it. Well, generally, slaves had to sit there and pick through this cotton, picking out all the little seeds before it could be turned into cloth. So very time-consuming, very labor-intensive process. However, Eli Whitney thought that his invention would kind of reduce the need for slavery. Unfortunately, it has the opposite effect. And so with the cotton gin, cotton becomes really profitable to be growing. And particularly in the South, where the climate is great for growing cotton, we'll see Southern planters want to expand their plantations. Cotton is a very harsh crop on the soil, and so they're not doing crop rotation or anything like that, and it depletes a lot of the nutrients, so they keep having to expand, clear land, move further west in order to have profitable plantations, which kind of leads us into something we'll talk about next week with the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. Is really all a side effect of Southern planters wanting to expand their plantations for cotton production because it was so profitable. The South will actually get the nickname called King Cotton, in which, cotton was king. I mean, people that grew cotton, these wealthy cotton plantation owners, become, some of the wealthiest people within the country. Again, you can see here, it has the opposite effect that Eli Whitney thought. More slaves are needed to grow more cotton throughout the South. So this actually increases the demand for slaves within the South. Kind of moving forward a little bit, we're going to be talking about interchangeable parts. And while, that might kind of seem boring, it really is important because, whether you're building like, a piece of IKEA furniture or whatever, it really is the basis that makes manufacturing so cheap, because you can just have someone that produces one part, and that part, it just makes it cheaper to put the whole product together. And you can see here a diagram of probably an early Colt revolver from the 1800s. And so originally designed for weapons, interchangeable parts were for practical purposes. Each part is identical. They were made to specifications, ensuring that they were identical to fit any type of device of the same type. Again, probably one of the major ways we think of interchangeable parts today would be like our auto parts. Could you imagine how expensive it would be if you had to go get say a new alternator and it had to be custom built for your car because there wasn't the ability of interchangeable parts. The ability that manufacturers and part manufacturers can mass produce an alternator for your car makes it so much cheaper to have that part and to fix your car. So this also extends to manufacturing machines as well. It's a lot cheaper to have a machine that you can just replace out one or two parts, get it back going again, versus having to have someone, a mechanic or a blacksmith come in and make that part custom. Again, transportation, so really waterways, roads, and early railroads. Really, we're not going to see railroads become super effective until the 1850s, kind of the 1840s and 1850s. We'll see their effects drastically in the Civil War. But as Americans moved west, so did commercial and industry also expanded west. Um, Particularly the Erie Canal opens up, trade with the Great Lakes, as I had mentioned. The United States being able to control the Mississippi opens up trade with kind of the interior of the continent. And as railroads start to connect major cities throughout the United States, we see populations kind of shift to those major cities, and that will be one thing that you will see with the Industrial Revolution is more and more people moving to cities. Particularly, Chicago will become a very important city during this time period because all the railroads, pretty much all major railroads, led to Chicago. It was a big, kind of hub where all of the railroads in the United States connected, making it a pretty important city for manufacturing. Also, the roads improved. I believe, yeah. So you can see here, kind of the construction of our roads improved. So you see kind of the old style there on top. They kind of didn't have good drainage. It would run off. It'd be very muddy. You kind of see here, the difference in roads. You kind of have this crude one on top here that's, pretty much just a path. But when you get high traffic on these, kind of poorly engineered railroads, they turn into a muddy mess. It's really hard to navigate through. And then you can see here on the bottom, kind of tampering down that soil, putting rock underneath the dirt, tampering it down, making more of a solid surface. And one of the big things is adding ditches, deeper ditches on each side for good drainage. That way the road doesn't erode away. And so putting these kind of larger stones on the bottom to give it more of a foundation, to make it more solid. Also, the federal government recognized the needs for railroads and also just regular roads, wagon roads. And so we talked a little bit about the Second National Bank already after the War of 1812. And so this bank really was set up to fund a lot of these projects. So you have the federal government kind of subsidizing a lot of these roads and subsidizing the cost of building railroads and building roads to connect the United States and really expand our economy, particularly to the west. Steam power, so shortly after the beginning of the century, steam power became to supplement muscle power. Typically, the horse, when we think of, those big steam engines for the early trains, that's really supplementing horsepower because, you don't have to ship everything by wagon or by ship. Now you have the ability to move a massive amount of goods, a massive amount of weight across land. So early steam engines were very inefficient, almost all required vast amounts of coal and fuel for a source. The efficiency of the steam engine will increase throughout the century, but ultimately by the end of the century and the early 1900s, the internal combustion engine will come to really replace the steam engine as the main source of energy and power. So steam power, James Watt improved the steam engine design in 1760 using heat more efficiently, and now coal would be used to power these steam engines. So when you kind of think, like probably you guys have seen like the Polar Express, where they're having to constantly shovel coal to heat the burner, to heat the water in order to create that power to move a piston and create power to move a train engine. You can see here exactly kind of the massive engines that are created during this time. I mean, you got to think about the engines that that are in power plants, engine applications, and major steamships. If any of you guys have ever seen the Titanic, you kind of see how they're using steam engines to power that massive ship. So steam provides a lot of torque. However, it takes a lot of fuel though to heat that steam up, to constantly have that water hot. And if you don't have that cold fuel source, you're not going to have that power. And also steam can be kind of dangerous as well because you're putting a lot of pressure and within a pot to create that pressure to move a piston. And if there's a small leak or anything like that, a steam engine is kind of very volatile. It can blow up pretty easy. That's one of the main reasons that the internal combustion engine kind of wins out over steam in the long run. Accelerating the manufacturing process. So we're not quite to the concept of the assembly line. That really becomes, the assembly line as we think of it today really is developed by Henry Ford in the 1920s. But we do see specified kind of jobs within a factory. So you'd have somebody that becomes specialized in weaving, somebody that you have mechanics that become specialized in working on a particular machine. And so you see specialization within the factory that does help speed up that manufacturing process. You don't have to have everybody be skilled in everything that within the factory. They can just be skilled on how to replace this one part, how to replace the bobs at the spindles, those sort of things. Just being able to do one thing really well within the factory. So this leads to a demand of a lot of unskilled labor, and this is one of the things that really, when we start looking at the bad sides of the early Industrial Revolution, is that this unskilled labor, generally took its form in the face of, in the early times it was women. Later on, it'll be immigrants coming to the United States, and these immigrants are coming to the United States relatively poor, coming in poverty, and their conditions really don't improve because the wages, unfortunately, when you have a job that doesn't require a lot of skill, you're easily replaced. That's why you can't command a high wage if you don't have a skill for that or a particular skill set. If you can do a job that a lot of other people can do, you can be easily replaced. Therefore, a company's not going to pay you a lot. And so that's what we see is this massive amounts of unskilled labor, massive amounts of low wages. And we'll actually kind of talk about the really economic divide that takes place within the North. Communication. So this is a huge advancement with Samuel Morse. You may kind of recognize his last name. He developed Morse code for his invention of the telegraph. So what we have now, with the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s, is a way to send messages over long distances. Because we talked about, in the War of 1812, with Andrew Jackson, he didn't get the news yet that the war had already been over, and he still attacked the British. Whereas, if the telegraph technology had been there, he probably would have gotten that news beforehand, probably avoiding that battle. But nonetheless, the telegraph mainly works by just sending electrical pulses over a wire that is picked up by a receiver on the other end, and it comes through in the form of just beeps. And so you can hold the telegraph down to send like a long beep, so it's called like dots and dashes. And that is the way those dots and dashes sent over the line. Once they are heard by the receiver, they using Morse code can be developed into letters and then sentences and words. And so this will actually be very important when we talk about the Civil War, because Abraham Lincoln was actually able to get messages out to his commanders almost in real time through the telegraph lines that were already in place up north. Also, we'll talk more about mass migration, not next week, but going into the third 6 weeks, particularly with things like the Irish famine, that we see a big influx of immigrants from Ireland, Western Europe. Later on in the century, we'll see an influx of immigrants from places like Italy and Greece and Southern Europe. But we see a mass influx of immigrants coming to the United States, and also we see a lot of people migrate. So there's a difference in immigration and migration. So migrate means you just move within your country. It'd be like moving from North Carolina to New York. And so what happens is we see a lot of people leave their farms because it's very expensive to own a farm. I mean, you got a lot of overheads, you got a lot of debt. If you can't pay for all that stuff outright or don't have an inheritance, you're going to go into a lot of debt to try to have a farm, and there's a big chance it'll be unsuccessful. And so you have a lot of people that move to these urban areas, and we see an explosion in population. And the infrastructure just wasn't there. You can see there to the right, how bad the living conditions were within cities because there's no good sewer system. The housing is, quickly thrown up. It's not quality built. You have, multiple families living in like within one room. You may have like one toilet for the entire street. One place to use the bathroom. So, these cities, explode in population. They're dirty. They're unsafe. There's no sorts of building codes in place during this time period. We can see the population density of the United States and really how it concentrates in the north, concentrating in places like New England, and around New Jersey and New York, and further west in places in Ohio such as Cincinnati and Cleveland. And eventually it'll extend, further west into places like Chicago. Um, but what's important about seeing this, population density and the changing population is going to be by the time we get to the Civil War, the North will have twice as many people as the South because the South is, again, sparsely populated. People live on rural farms. It's mainly agricultural, whereas the North is going to see this industrialization really take hold early on. And even today, we see the effects of this with a lot of our industrialization or factories being based in places like Pennsylvania and New York, and so forth. So there are no child labor laws during this time period. To survive, the lowest levels of poverty, every family member had to work in order just to, try and have enough money to get enough food and have a roof over your head. And so this led to the high rise in child labor in factories. Children are not treated well. They were overworked and underpaid. So you could pay a child a lot less to do a simple task than you could pay a grown adult to do that same task. And so therefore, child labor became very specialized in doing these kind of little jobs as far as like changing out the spindles, for the weaving machines, kind of just carrying things around the factory. But what's very unsafe about that, for one, you have a young child working around machinery with no safety measures in place. You can see here this young boy doesn't even have shoes on, working what looks to be like a weaving machine, and kind of wearing loose clothing and things like that. And so you have children running through the factories. It wasn't uncommon for children to lose like a finger, lose a leg, to get snagged in one of these machines. For young girls, if they didn't have their hair pulled back or that sort of thing, that long hair could get caught in the machine and it would be fatal. And so, this leads legislation and it'll lead to groups organizing saying this is not right. We can't have children being killed in the while the factory owner is living it up in the city and making killer profits. And so you can see here some of the nasty conditions that children are faced with. I mean, we're talking about really low levels of poverty that we a lot of times don't see anymore in the United States, thankfully. But you can see some of the political cartoons. The wealthy business owner is just trying to keep his expenses as low as possible. And with it, and kids aren't allowed to go to school. This is one of the things that leads to school being compulsory. As much as people really, I hear students sometimes gripe about having to go to school and how it's mandatory. Well, that really, the reason for that, and one of the early reasons for that was to get children out of the factories and force them into school, so that way they would have, some sort of education and could get a better job versus, having to work in these terrible conditions in the factories. So children often worked 12, 14-hour days. They toiled in horrible conditions. Working near large and heavy and dangerous equipment was extremely common. It was not until the Factory Act of 1833 did things slightly improve. There was still child labor, but children were paid only a fraction of what adults were. Again, you could get a child to do those small tasks a lot cheaper than you could get a adult to do the same job. A lot of these kids in the factories were from orphanages, so it wasn't uncommon for factory owners to go to an orphanage, round up some children to take and have them work in the factory. And so you can kind of see here you have the northern capitalist and you have the children on the auction block, similar to slaves in the South, being sold and auctioned off to these wealthy business owners. So you have, people, and it's really sad to think about it. You have people profiting off of the suffering of others, and so this is, met with a lot of opposition, and eventually, there's a lot of corruption, and at least this great divide that we'll see in the cities between, the wealthy and the poor. Slave labor increased, as I mentioned earlier, with this need for more cotton, and as cotton production became pretty excuse me, as cotton production became more profitable throughout the South. Also, pollution is unregulated during this time, so you have factories just dumping toxic chemicals into rivers, contaminating waterways. I mean, even some of the pollution that comes from this early time period in the 1800s still plagues, places within the North, particularly around like New York and Pittsburgh and those places where it was totally unregulated. A lot of this coal ash and things were just dumped into the soil, dumped into the waterways. And so we see a lot of pollution and no regulation on pollution. We're still over 100 years away from even organizations such as the EPA being created to try to regulate some of the pollution of these factories and hold them accountable. And the last thing we'll talk about here is disease. So when you have a lot of people cramped in dirty conditions, you can guarantee that there's going to be widespread disease. And so there's no adequate infrastructure in place. There's no good sewage. So you have waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera, which will become rampant. It's not until an Englishman in the early 1800s or mid 1800s realized that, hey, if we have a outhouse or a public kind of cesspit right here, and we have our drinking water, only a few football fields away, when we see that happen, we see cholera outbreaks in the population that's using that well. So he put two and two together and realized, like, hey, we have to either start boiling our water, we have to treat our water, but the main thing we need to do is have some sewage system in place. That way we get that human waste out and it doesn't contaminate our wells and contaminate our water supply. So diseases and the understanding of diseases will develop as the Industrial Revolution moves forward. But there's generally a lack of adequate medicine. Again, crowded, dirty housing makes for unhealthy living and easily for disease to easily spread. And also, there's this last image here, like I have with the earth coffin. We see mass destruction of the forests of New England, the forests of the South, clearing of land, depleting resources just at a really fast pace. And also, when we think about Americans pushing further west, one of the reasons for that is to search for more resources as we used up our environments on the East Coast. And so that's what I'm going to end it with. I was a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but nonetheless, it was a lot of information to go through. I will be talking more about this next week. Hopefully, we'll be able to start talking about Andrew Jackson, but I want us to have enough time to really spin and kind of dive into industrialization because it is important in shaping, American politics, society, and economics as well. So if you have any questions about this, just let me know, and I will make another video going over what I want you guys to do for the Lowell Mills